The following is a CUNY TV special presentation.
Good evening. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and it's my great privilege to be the president of this extraordinary institution, Hunter College, and to welcome you all tonight to this important discussion of John Lindsay, New York, and the American Dream. For many here this evening, myself included, it was Lindsay who drew us into public service. I was an 8-year-old girl in Washington Heights when I walked into what he called one of his little city halls, and what I later learned was a political office. But by then it was too late because I had caught the public service bugs, as many of you here tonight. Many of us were inspired by Lindsay and his vision of city government as a vibrant and exciting place to work. It is especially appropriate to hold this event here tonight at Hunter because John Lindsay represented our college along with the rest of the Upper East Side when he was in Congress, and he represented us in his special Lindsay way. There was the time when two bills went to the floor of the House, one to let the Postmaster General impound obscene mail, the other to let him seize mail from communist countries. Lindsay voted against both. When asked how he could oppose legislation to combat pornography and communism, he replied that those are the major industries of his constituency. And if there were a shutdown, quote, the 17th district would be a depressed area. And then there was the quintessential Lindsay city snob line. I'm from New York, and I don't trust air that I can't see. This evening's event is appropriately sponsored by the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, which is dedicated to establishing the connections in policymaking between the past and the present, since much of this discussion will explore the relevance of the Lindsay legacy to the new New York City administration. That is certainly fitting, since like Bill de Blasio, our new mayor, Lindsay identified himself as a progressive on political and social issues. And Mayor de Blasio must too deal with a governor from the same party, but not always, it would seem, the same point of view. And then there's the most prominent thing these two mayors have in common. They're both so darn tall. New York Magazine even ran an article in 1969 headline, "Is Lindsay too tall to be mayor?" And he was actually 2 inches shorter than Bill de Blasio. Roosevelt House sponsorship is also appropriate because it was Lindsay who renamed what was then called Welfare Island as Roosevelt Island, and then proposed creating a memorial to this great New Yorker on the southern tip. As mayor, Lindsay had many ties to Hunter College, including close associations with 2 of our most famous graduates. One was Bess Meyerson, whose career in politics he launched when he made her his Commissioner of Consumer Affairs. And then there was the tough Hunter girl, Bella Abzug. She helped make Lindsay a feminist, and when he joined forces with her in opposing the war in Vietnam, he helped make her a national figure. She and Lindsay joined forces again when she went to Congress, and they worked to steer federal economic aid to the city. Now, that relationship wasn't always warm and fuzzy, but then relationships with Bella rarely were. Sid Davidoff, who is here with us this evening, remembers the time Bella was coming up in the front door of City Hall. Mayor Lindsay turned to him and said, "You handle her this time," and proceeded to slip out the side door. There are so many old friends and distinguished guests here of the Lindsay administration that it's impossible to acknowledge all of them. But I do want to extend, on behalf of all of us, a special welcome to the members of the Lindsay family who have joined us tonight. Let's have a round of applause for the wonderful Lindsay family. And finally, there's one person who deserves special recognition because this event, like so many other things in New York, would have never happened without him, and that is Jay Kriegel. It was his vision to hold this conference and to keep the Lindsay family memory alive. Jay also helped conceive the extraordinary book that is the basis of this discussion, Summer in the City, which was edited by Hunter College's own Professor Joe Vitariti. Dr. Vitariti is the chair of our Hunter Planning and Urban Affairs Department and the Thomas Hunter Professor of Public Policy. Joe actually graduated from Hunter the same year that Lindsay was reelected mayor and worked for him that year as a volunteer. He went on to write his master's thesis on Lindsay's police department and then did his doctoral dissertation on Lindsay's management reforms. How appropriate to have one of our own and this great Lindsay scholar open our conference. Please join me first in watching the next video clip and then welcoming Dr. Joe Vitariti to launch our conversation.
I'm John Lindsay. I was born in New York City, and I've lived here all my life. And I'm running for mayor because I know that our city is in a crisis. Everyone knows the facts about crime, schools, safety, air pollution, water pollution, transportation, and all the rest. But the worst thing of all is the feeling of apathy and indifference that exists among our people. I say that New York City can do a job. I say that our city can lead the country. And I'm prepared to do the job if you'll give me a chance. We need a change, and we need it now.
We want John! 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 We want John!
Ladies and gentlemen, the apparent winner of this election is Mr. John Lindsay.
I plan to give New York the most hardworking, the most dedicated, and I hope the most exciting and successful administration this city has ever seen. I guessed wrong on the weather before the city's biggest snowfall last winter, and that was a mistake. But I put 6,000 more cops on the streets, and that was no mistake. The school strike went on too long, and we all made some mistakes. But I brought 225,000 new jobs to this town, and that was no mistake. And I fought for 3 years to put a 4th police platoon on the streets, and that was no mistake. And I reduced the deadliest gas in the air by 50%, and I forced the landlords to roll back unfair rents. And we did not have a Detroit, a Watts, or a Newark in this city, and those were no mistakes. The things that go wrong are what make this the second toughest job in America. But the things that go right are what make me want it.
Good to be here. Let me just say, when Jay Kriegel asked me to do this, I had to say yes. But he didn't tell me that I was going to be the youngest person by a number of years. For perspective, I can tell you that I met Mayor Lindsay when I was about 5 years old. And I was living at the time, and this does say something, I think, about the successes of the administration and of that time. I was living in the Manhattanville houses, housing projects in West Harlem. My father was at the time, I guess he would have been a sergeant in the NYPD. Went to Head Start, played in the parks, and you know, the different programs that were out there, the different things that were available to us were just sort of part of growing up. And I always saw that as a straight line between those programs and those possibilities and where my sisters and I all ended up. So I mean, I think of the Lindsay administration as sort of the ground upon which I mean, literally was born, and the things that were going on. I do think also, though, that there has been this sort of history that's been put over it. And so when I read about times that I vaguely remember as a child, I think to myself, it couldn't have been like that. But I guess you all are here to help set that record straight.
You know, we were called the Kiddie Corps back then, and so I think a lot of people thought we were 5'2", Harold.
I met him at a parade, and he said, "What's your name, young man?" I said, "You know my name. I know yours." Making of a journalist. I got better at answering questions. So I want to hear from each of you whether, how it felt to be in there every day. And I want to start with day one. Did you see the transit strike coming? Was it a storm that kind of overwhelmed everything else? Or did you kind of come in on a war footing and assume that, well, we're going to have some problems and this could be one of them?
It was coming. We couldn't have stopped it. After John Lindsay won, Robert Wagner disappeared. The administration disappeared. Those people who should have left didn't want to leave because they wanted to stay in their office, but we tried to make them leave. As we got to the union negotiation, there was really very little structure within the Lindsay administration organization to deal with what had to be dealt with. And he was clear that he wasn't going to give what they were asking. I also think it was clear that Quill, who was then head of the Transport Workers Union, needed to strike. He needed to establish his leadership. And this was going to be a strike no matter what we did in that situation.
And so
Were we prepared for it? That's another question. I don't know that we could have done anything differently than what he did to get to the point. That's when we look back on, and we discussed this among ourselves, we look back on a lot of different things we might have done differently. But this is one that was inevitable, and I'm not sure we could have been better prepared.
Folks, talk a little bit about what it was like to work with John Lindsay. What kind of a boss was he?
I joined it in the second administration. In the first election, I went with Robert Kennedy while he campaigned for Abe Beam. And it was, because I was the only Democrat at City Hall when I joined it after that. Bobby Kennedy said, "Do you know anybody who has charisma other than John Lindsay?" to me one day after we went to a rally. So it was that competition between the two of them at the time. When I joined the campaign. I met Jay during the school strike. Jack Newfield used to bring him up to the house all the time to talk about what was going on, what do people think. And then my friend Barry Goddard asked me to come in after Lindsay lost the Republican primary and Procaccino won the Democratic primary, and I organized the Democrats for Lindsay. And I never met Mayor Lindsay. I went to work in the campaign. And part of it, it's interesting because we talked about the political background and the demise of the Democrat, or the problems of the Democratic Party. It was also at the height of the reform movement. I mean, we had just really made major defeats in the leadership of the Democratic Party, especially in Manhattan, but partly in the city, so that when Lindsay ran in '65, he got a lot of dissident Democrats supporting him. I, being a district leader and loyal to the senator, I was in a funny spot. So Dick Aurelio asked me if I'd like to join the administration, and I was housewife with 3 kids and a husband. And I thought, I'm going to go back to work. It was great. How much do I want? What title do I want? I had no idea. But I went over to City Hall, and not to City Hall, to Gracie Mansion, and I met the mayor, and he asked me what I thought, and I said what I'd like, because I also talked to other people before I went, and I went to work, and I loved it. I was the oldest member of the staff, aside from the deputy mayor. I'm still the oldest member, right? And the only Democrat. And it was a glorious job, and I loved every minute of it. I thought the mayor was astonishing. He was what Sam really said earlier. And we all really did believe we could change the world.
First of all, he was serious. He was serious about the job of government. He cared about it. He worked at it. If he didn't understand something, he either tried to learn it or he tried to figure out who he could trust on it. If you got into trouble, he backed you. Not unthinkingly, not blindly, but this guy had the knack of amplifying you, whereas many bosses in public life restrain you. They're living in fear you're going to go around the next corner too fast. He would kick people sometimes to go around the next corner faster. And he had both. That's very, very rare. Third of all, he understood, as he and Fred Hayes used to talk with each other, it doesn't take 30 good people to run New York City or 300, it takes 3,000. As I think was mentioned in the earlier panel, the whole next generations of New York City and New York State leadership came out of that administration. He used to drive Ed Koch nuts when people would point out to him how many of his really good appointments came from Lindsay land, if I can use that phrase.
Well, I would add to all that it was exciting. He was a great boss for a young person, particularly emphasizing what Peter said, his willingness to let you make mistakes and back you doing that, and basically saying, first time I thought I did something horrible, walked into his office and was scared to death I'd be fired. He put his glasses up, he roared, and he said, go back and do it again and again and again until you get it right. And it was just a wonderful message for someone of 5 or 25. But I think also that John Lindsay, and you don't hear any of this in the panels of historians, John Lindsay had a clarity of vision and a fierce set of principles that let you know what he really believed in and where he was going. And it was extraordinary to work for someone who was that clear about the direction he wanted to take the city in. I just remember in the '65 campaign, when I was a young director of research, we started getting all these letters about the Vietnam War. There were only 2 elected officials who'd come out against the war in the United States at that point. And Lindsay in '65 was going around New York City talking about the war. And I said to him one night, "Why are you talking about the war? You're running for mayor. It's just getting people angry." And he said, "I'll talk about whatever I want to. Don't tell me what I should believe and talk about. You do your job." So,
We'll say a little more about that. I mean, was this a vision that he felt he was developing with, with millions of New Yorkers, or was this sort of personal beliefs that he wanted to put out there regardless of the political consequences?
well, listen, the fundamental vision and principle, of course, was to open up a government and the institutions that support it, which he thought were closed, to a whole group of people who were the new outsiders. Primarily, it was primarily racial then. It was blacks and Hispanics. And he didn't need reinforcement. He saw it everywhere. Of course, as a Cabot Surf's essay makes clear, and as mentioned earlier, a Republican who came out of the Congress who saw the Jim Eastlands and the Richard Russells blocking civil rights legislation felt very comfortable, and who saw Tammany Hall in New York felt very comfortable believing that the Lincoln Republican and Teddy Roosevelt Republican Party was much more progressive. He was not at all embarrassed about being a Republican fighting for civil rights and for progressive values. But I think those values, which were really what that administration was about, and when I hear the question asked by Sam, what would you do differently? On the fundamental issues, I would do nothing differently. On the fundamental issues, John Lindsay was right. History has proven him right. He took this city through an extraordinary transition that all his successes could build on. Sam Roberts has a fabulous sentence in his book about Lindsay, in which he said that, if John Lindsay hadn't held the city together and hadn't opened the city up to new people, what would there have been for Ed Koch, Rudy Giuliani, and Mike Bloomberg to build on? And I believe that's profoundly important.
If I can, since you asked a question about working for John Lindsay, I think of a story of John that probably explains this mayor to me as an individual. He taught me a lot. He taught me not to believe my own press releases. I mean, we had a lot of conversations about different things. But I remember a night early on in an East New York, Canarsie area where we were going to speak at a school, and it was multiracial. It wasn't either the full side of Canarsie or East New York. And it was a demonstration within that school that wouldn't let John speak, wouldn't let the mayor speak about. And the demonstration was of parents because a kid had been killed by a speeding car near a school. And it was the 3rd or 4th instance, and it had fallen on deaf ears. And it became so bad, the mayor couldn't speak. We had to get him out the back door. We pulled a limousine in the front. In those days, we had a limousine. Pulled in the front. That's where everybody went to complain more and with their placards. And we took him out the side, and I'm driving him in the car back to Gracie Mansion, and I'm livid. I'm trying to figure out how are we going to get even. What disrespect they could have for the mayor of the city of New York, and I'm steaming in, and he says, "Sid, tomorrow you get on this. They're that angry. There must be a reason." And that was John Lindsay. He grasped the situation differently than the rest of us saw it. He wanted to solve the problem.
The time was so different also. I think from my point of view, the communities were so much more active. So you had this time that he's the mayor, where you got people marching across the bridge. You've got the building, the construction workers, coming into City Hall to lower the flag. You've got the gays out there after Stonewall. You've got the women who want to change all the alimony laws. You've got the poor who are living in shelters. You've got all these SROs and welfare hotels. We had them then, and we didn't really have an agency yet. And you've got, of course, all the people who needed help. But those people, the difference also was in the population. They were out there to make their demands. Giuliani rode roughshod over them. He had the sharpshooters up on the roof when somebody came. And Bloomberg had phoned them all, so there was no resistance because they were afraid they were going to lose their voice. But what happened was the Lindsay administration was so much more responsive, I think, to the needs of the city. It was a people's government. And I don't think we've had that since.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, it seems that the goal of maximum feasible participation was really sort of pushed to the limit in a lot of cases, in a way that, as you suggest, we haven't seen since in other administrations. Was there ever a point where you might have said to one another, hey, you know what, we're getting rolled here, or things are spinning out of our control, we need to do this a little bit differently?
Every day. You got to remember what we had. We had Abby Hoffman with the Yippies. Whenever he felt like it, at 2 o'clock in the morning, he would take a soapbox out on 8th Street and St. Mark's Place and stop traffic and start talking, and with his megaphone, and then go back and get stoned. You have the young lords. You had they say Sonny Costa taking over the anti-poverty office in Crown Heights, and on and on. You had Columbia. This was a time when people voiced their differences with government, let's say, in a very extreme way. So going to sleep every night, which was about maybe 4 in the morning, and getting up at 6 to see what you did wrong that day and what was about to happen the next day, and having the mayor say, get up to Lincoln Hospital, police commissioner tells me they took it over again. But, there were times when you started really scratching your head as to what was real and what was not real.
We have now the mayor's management report, which has got 1,000 different metrics and immaculately presented in PowerPoints and so forth. Of course, the backbone of the information technology wasn't even available. But what were you trying to measure on a day-to-day basis? What was assuming there wasn't some big burning emergency that was going to swamp everything else? What were you trying to measure? How were you trying to gauge your success?
I'm going to get there, Errol. I'm going to get there with one quick detour that I want all of us to get. One of the most remarkable things about this government and this man who led it was that they excelled in 2 dimensions. The first dimension we've heard about, the stress, opening up the city to minorities who had not been represented, violence, threat of wackiness. This was a city that didn't have any riots, remember? On that dimension, public commitment to values, understanding what the battle about race in this country was all about and the battle about poverty. And on a totally different dimension, this man built the strongest, most outstanding bank of talent, analytic, and management capacity of any city in the country. Either one alone is a great accomplishment. Both is really amazing. So what was it like in the part of the government I ran? It was like coming in and trying to clean out a stable full of crap, old bodies, corruption. I'm only exaggerating a little. The city had the last strong generation of city management had been the Depression generation. Most of them were 50 or 60 when we got there. And one of the things we had to slow, almost as in combat, hill by hill, department by department, we had to put people in, focus them, decide, as you say, what we were going to measure. I remember the uproar in the police department. The first budget, not Lindsay, this was the first budget, this is the budget we put out that came out in July 67, so it would have been gone over with the mayor. Second budget, thank you, Jay. We decided we're going to measure something called effective patrol units in the police department. Not an advanced comment, ladies and gentlemen, concept. How many police units are on the street given the expenditure? How much does the police department went nuts? You went, absolutely, you're going to measure what? How many police patrol units? Just take that department by department. Health, nightmare. Lindsay administration did open up the police department. I would say they made a crack in the fire department. That was tough. Other areas you go down, it was like teaching an unruly, lazy, old government from scratch.
Did he have efficiency experts or professors whispering in his ear? Where was the motivation coming from for that?
I don't think that's quite the word for it. We had a director of the budget who was a genius. His name was Fred Hayes, and he had narcolepsy. And he smoked. And when he fell asleep and smoked in meetings, the room, including Lindsay, just, looking like this. I remember one long meeting, Fred falls asleep, and it's on housing, and Jay Nathan is there, he's pontificating, sorry, he's the housing administrator, you don't know these names. Anyway, Jay's going on, everybody's arguing, and Fred's fallen asleep during the meeting. Meeting's over, he wakes up, and Lindsay decides to pull his chain, and he turns to me and says, Fred, would you sum up? And Hayes sums up perfectly. Another guy and I walk out with him. Okay, Fred, what the hell? How did you do that? He says, every housing discussion always covers the same issues.
One of the, along the same lines, there's a lot that's been written in one of the legacies of the administration of the community boards, the community planning districts, and coterminality, and trying to sort of move everything down to that level. Was that seen as an efficiency measure, or sort of a service delivery model, or was it also about politics and about trying to sort of break the back of some of the local machines out in the neighborhoods?
The summer of '66 was really seminal. The first neighborhood disturbance occurred in East New York in July of '66. East New York is a long way from City Hall. And Sid, myself, Barry, ran out the first night and basically spent a month out there and ended up the first neighborhood City Hall. But one of the things we found out, there was no way from City Hall that you could find out anything about what was going on in East New York on a day-to-day basis. City Hall knew nothing about the communities in New York. Why? Because it was very simple. The city had the Democratic organization. So the information system for New York City was the clubhouses around the city. You wanted a street light, you wanted your garbage picked up differently, you went to your district leader. So it wasn't so much forming a different political system, but creating something that could make the government responsive locally and simultaneously figure out how you could give the local sanitation man, the local cop, the local parks person some real power to get things done. So that was the real challenge. I think Sid and Ronnie have both described some of the craziness of the streets, and I do think what is missing from so many of the books, and you really have to watch videos to get a sense of what the country was like in the '60s. Anybody who walks into City Hall in any decade since then has no idea what it would really be like to have that kind of turmoil. And Ronnie said it best, I think, given what was going on out there, with all due respect to Vince Canato, I defy anybody to have tried to control the city in that era. And Lindsay's approach was really to open the doors and to deal with people and to try to work things out, because those forces on the street, that pent up fury and rage and energy was just uncontrollable. And it really started in East New York because in the first weekend, not knowing what to do, this was a battle between whites and blacks, Italian kids and black kids over a piece of turf, a classic turf battle, a literal piece of land in East New York. And Lindsay decided to invite all of the community leaders to City Hall. In fact, that was really, in many ways, the beginning, a precursor to that only being Lindsay's entire campaign was going around the city and walking everywhere and being with the people. See, so it's this odd thing about this patrician wasp, very tall, not quite as tall as the mayor now, but very tall, but who was much more responsive and open to what was going on in every neighborhood for an odd combination of reasons than I think any mayor we've had since then.
It was also the time of the Welfare Rights Organization and George Wiley and all the welfare recipients, and they camped out. Do you remember this? They camped out in City Hall Park, and then they were going to have a thing. They wanted to give the mayor their list of demands, and these guys all, I don't know, somehow it got dumped on me. I remember.
Reasonable.
I remember Jeffrey Katzenberg was coming. He came to get me at a certain place he had put me when it was time for me to go to the head of the steps
Welfare
to receive
rights
the
was
demands.
was under you.
Right. So there's George Wiley, whose daughter, incidentally, I think is now working for de Blasio.
Exactly right.
Well, he was great, and he comes up, walking up the stairs, and I'm at the head of the stairs, and all the local television crews are there waiting. And they had waited too long, and they were impatient. They wanted to make the 6 o'clock news. Anyway, he had his afro and his dashiki on, and he walks up, and first he hugs me because we're friends. And then he steps back and reads the list of demands about all the kids that are dying from lead poisoning and starving and this and that and everything else. And I took them, and I don't know what I said, but I took the list, and I said we would be back to them. And I went downstairs to my office. And 3 minutes later, this young man comes to the office, and he said, Mrs. Eldridge, could I have that list of demands? We gave you our only copy. And it was on the 6 o'clock news. I mean, it was the big news of the day.
Yeah, we did not have the political organization that we could get the kinds of things that we should be getting from the communities. So the little city halls became our outreach. Our task force in the local communities became our outreach, and later on, the community boards became it. They were the ones who fed back to us. And a lot of the things were small problems that could be dealt with. A lot of it had to do with, housing and education, just like today. But in a lot of things, it was the frustration of not even being able to get a hoop fixed on a basketball, rim, because there was no one to do it, or a water fountain working, or a park bench, or cleaning up a little park that was overrun with rats. And it was that we could respond to that, having the information. And that was a key thing. John Lindsay walking in Harlem in 1968 after Martin Luther King, when this city didn't burn, and we looked across the river and we saw the fires, wasn't about that that night. It was about 3 years or 2 years leading to that night that he could walk down the street and had the people's respect that he was there because he cared. It was not the first time he was on 125th Street. It was not the 10th time. It probably was the 50th time. He was there, they'd seen him, he cared, and he came up to be with them.
To what extent were you, not just when it came to things like civil unrest, but sort of looking at the other cities, looking at Daley and Chicago and Rizzo and Philadelphia, whoever, and comparing yourselves to them?
That's Jay.
That was you.
Well, this was a period when there was one leader of the cities of America, was John Lindsay. The one outlier probably was Dick Daley in Chicago. I spent a lot of effort. I actually, in retrospect, not sure why. Maybe almost a personal request, getting Lindsay and Daley together in a meeting with Daley's chief of staff, and that meeting lasted less than 3 minutes. We got together in the meeting room in Washington. Daley came in. Lindsay said a few things, and Daley just effectively said, "Fuck you." But he just said, got up and walked out, and it was stunning. There were two people, couldn't have two people further apart. But I think my favorite Lindsay Daley episode was in '68 after Martin Luther King. His death, when Chicago was having terrible troubles, and they didn't have today's communication, but across the ticker came a story that Mayor Daley had issued a shoot-to-kill order in Chicago. And, we ran in and talked to the mayor, and about 2 minutes later, John Lindsay issued a statement in New York City saying, "We don't shoot children in New York City." And to me, that's probably the proudest moment of 8 years. I think Lindsay's, despite all the anxieties and all the fear and everything that's going on in the middle class, and there's no way to bridge that gap, Lindsay understood exactly what government should do, exactly what the role of the police and the use of deadly force was, and never wavered on that for 8 years, no matter what the pressure was. And I think the feeling of pride that you can take 40 years later is really a wonderful thing to carry with you.
He talked about Saturday night specials, especially when he was running, and especially in the Florida primary, right? Saturday night specials, the cheap guns that were coming in. I mean, he was really out on that issue, and that was a very unpopular stance, and of course didn't help with his chances.
Here's what I've been wondering about is Nixon gets elected in 1968. At a practical level, the flow of federal funds
Nixon,
is greatly disrupted in the second term. The Hard Hat Riot in 1970. Did you have a sense that show's over, the mood of the country is changing, that this presidential effort to sort of move the Lindsay administration onto the national stage in that way was maybe out of sync with where the country was going?
Yeah, first, I think from John Lindsay's point of view, I think he felt that way. That's why he ran. I don't think that John Lindsay, and I have reason to believe that John Lindsay ran believing that he'd win the Democratic presidential nomination in 1972. He ran to again put the urban areas, the cities, on the focus of what should be happening in this country, because they were being forgotten. It was being shoved back. And he was the conscience of the city. When you think of, this is America's man. Taking from Giuliani, I guess, America's man was, at that time, certainly John Lindsay, from the media's point of view, the most recognizable mayor in the world, actually. So he understood when he was running what was happening, and he needed to state that out.
And we talked about those issues. I mean, I remember talking about the difference, why the federal government isn't doing the welfare payments, why people are coming from Mississippi to New York because of the difference in the money that could be get. I mean, those were issues that were discussed in that campaign. It wasn't it wasn't a personality kind of thing at all, I don't think. And people actually liked him. I was in California, and they loved him.
They didn't vote for him. They liked him.
They didn't have a chance. No, wait a minute. They didn't have a chance.
Florida, they loved him.
The gays especially liked him in California because they knew of his record here. Interesting. And that was in the 70s. Anyway.
I can't help saying that it's probably 2 years ago, I walked out of theater singing Normal Heart and woke Ronnie up to say that watching that play about the AIDS epidemic in the Koch era and what was going on in the city government made me feel incredible sense of respect for her, that when we were all very far behind her in the early 70s, she opened up City Hall to the Mattachine Society, gays who were...
The Gay Liberation Alliance.
All these characters.
Gay Alliance.
And led to Lindsay issuing the executive order. And I think without Ronnie, none of that would have happened. She really has clairvoyance.
You know,
Accept the accolade.
Thank you. All right, I won't talk.
She's also a fetch and a nudge.
They always made fun of me.
Let me tell you, no one has ever driven me crazier in my life than Ronnie about lead poisoning, a list of issues.
I was going to say, as soon as they saw me, they all wanted to go away. But it was interesting from a woman's point of view, because I came from being a housewife. I mean, I was a Democratic district leader. I was active in the Reform movement, but I had 3 kids. I had a husband. I brought common sense. You know, here I had all these young hotshots. And it was such an important moment, I think, for realizing the talents that women have. I want to tell one other story, because we have a member of the audience who participated in a funny kind of way. I had the task force. They gave me Greenwich Village. And I go to my first meeting, and then somebody gets up and says, you know, young lady, what are we going to hear from you? Your predecessor's in jail. It was Jim Marcus, and he had been the result. And so they started screaming about me that this was a corrupt thing. Anyway, the village. So I knew then, I learned about SROs, the welfare hotels, all different kinds of problems just from that place. And one of the hotels is now a condominium on Bleecker Street called the Atrium. But at that time it was called the Broadway, wasn't the Broadway Central, it was something else.
Central Plaza.
No, it wasn't that either. But anyway, it was a hotel built as a shelter for indigent men in the late 1800s. So it had a big atrium, and around it ran all these rooms that were just hard chicken wire up to about here and then open, you know, or whatever. And we organized a tenants committee there. We had a social service unit there. We had St. Vincent had a health unit outside. We also gave out the welfare checks outside because we thought the landlord, the owner, was corrupt. So anyway, we organized a tenants committee, and one day the social worker calls and says, you know, the president of the tenants committee didn't show up, and I'm worried about him. We think he may have been arrested. So I called Bill Vandenhoevel, who was then the chair of the Board of Corrections, and he sent a young lawyer named Mr. Cherry. I called the superintendent, or the head of the tombs, and I said that Mr. Cherry was coming. Mr. Cherry went to the jail. He said, he asked for the tenants committee chair. They brought him up, and he said, Mayor Lindsay sent me to bring you home. Now, just think of something like that happening today.
Bill de Blasio tried it a couple
Had a
of
version
weeks
of
ago.
that.
That's true.
Had a version of that just recently.
Sorry.
Well, you know,
I wanted to mention it for Bill.
in time capsule fashion, I mean, I've asked a few of you. I think I asked Jay. I think I asked Sid. I said, look, have they called you up from City Hall? Have they asked you for a little wisdom, a little advice, and so forth? And I know you all are, in some cases, still very active and involved, but give some advice to the kids who are there now. There are a lot of young people who are going into government for the first time. They're riding on what they think is a wave of popular enthusiasm. We'll see how that works out. And they've got some ideas. I mean, I think it's meaningful that today happens to be the day that Mayor de Blasio signed his first piece of legislation into law, and it's the paid sick leave law. This is why a lot of these kids got into public service. This is going to be what they tell some audience about 40 years from now. What's your advice to them?
We talked in the earlier panel a little bit about some of the common things between de Blasio and John Lindsay, but one of them we didn't quite hit. That's the difficulty of working with a governor of your own party who's quite gifted and is thinking about running for president, which we left out of the comparison. On many of the big issues, the mayor of New York by himself can do relatively little, especially the big economic and the inequality issues. So I would say to the young people in that administration, think early about building allies statewide and think strategically about how you're going to enlist the state. I had an experience that very few people have had. Approximately a year after John Lindsay left office, Hugh Carey asked me to be his budget director. For those of you with weak memories, that was with cymbals and drums, the beginning of the fiscal crisis. And once you rip the outer layer off the structure of the city and the state, I was amazed. And I should have known this from my city days, but I didn't. It's not known how intertwined the city and the state are. Here's a number that you don't find in Joe's book and that you don't find in any briefing for city and state officials. Roughly 75% of state and New York City expenditures are on the same things, on the same systems of care service, governed very often by either 2 layers or 1 layers of rules. So you've got to have a strategy for that. You've got to watch the opportunity function. When I was growing up, there were 3 or 4 funnels of opportunity in this country. John Lindsay was very interested in opportunity. These were ladders by which people who wanted to make their way could get a job, get a decent living, buy a house. Some of them got retirement plans. Without realizing it, because we don't think structurally in this country, we've begun to close off those funnels of opportunity. The growth of state and local government employment around the country. The draft in the Army, which used to reach way down, doesn't reach way down anymore. The growth in the health sector, which we've got to change, because we can't carry the kind of increasing health sector we've got. And an area that nobody mentioned in either panel that the Lindsay administration helped open up, higher education. Those are the 4 government-created and managed funnels of opportunity in this country, and we have been choking them off. So in a city with a leader like de Blasio, we've got to watch those 4 funnels and begin to think how to get some of them working again. I want to make one other comment on Joe's book. It's a good book. You should read this book. Even for those of us who were there for some of the time, it opened it up. It was really good. There's a wonderful point that makes me a little bit sad about my country because we're so divided and so paralyzed now. He says that both now and during the Lindsay years, there was to some degree the spending of money we didn't have. I'm an old budget director, but I got to admit, that was a little bit true. But Joe goes on, when Lindsay was mayor, we spent it for the poor and those in need. And today, we spend it to help the rich.
Yeah. I liked your last comment, Peter. I had no idea what you said before that. Nothing changes. If I gave that advice to someone at City Hall, like when I was out, I had no idea what you said. Anyway, Peter and I never agreed on anything. And then Jay took over. But, to me, it's the fight. One thing about us is that we really believed. That was our time. John Lindsay made us believe. I think Bill de Blasio will make us believe. He's got a program. He wants to do it. And every day they're going to get up. Some young assistants are going to get up and get beat over the head, be in the front line. And you just when you go to bed that night, you get up the next day. It's another day. You got to take the punches, and you got to really, if you really feel that you're right, there'll be good days. There'll be a lot more bad days, but those good days that come are great. So it's just getting up and fighting every day.
Ronnie.
Well, I was just thinking you can see from the 4 of us that we're so different, and that the government included all of us, and we all participated in it, and I love every one of them. But I agree with you. Sometimes I didn't understand some of them. But I think to listen to everybody, I think that's very important. If somebody calls your office, you listen to them. I mean, somebody called and wanted a canoe because they were going to liberate the Statue of Liberty. but you still talk to them. That's what's so important. And people have, they're sources of great information for you, and I think that they have to have respect for people. Some people who continually complain, or some people who are that one item like me, but you've got to listen to them, and you've got to respect them and include them in what your thinking is going to be. I think that's, there shouldn't be a sense of superiority or, we know best.
I remember in 1966, at a very young age, John Lindsay called me one day and said, would you do me a favor? Would you meet with this old friend of mine who wants to talk to you about the LaGuardia administration and give you some ideas and advice of what we should do, and you meet with him, I don't want to. And he was a very old guy, probably in his late 50s. And we sat there for an hour, and I have to say, and he droned on endlessly, a little like Peter, and I had no idea what he was saying. And I just remember, I can remember it today, saying to myself, please, Lord, when I'm his age, don't ever let me sit with young people at City Hall telling him what it was like in the Lindsay era. And I was having lunch with one of de Blasio's young aides, a little older than I was, but roughly comparable, and starting to tell her about some things that we had done, and suddenly stopped and said, let me just figure this out. LaGuardia ended 20 years before Lindsay started. If I go back to when Lindsay ended compared to de Blasio, which is 40 years, the mayor for us would have been John Hyland. So what would it have been like if Lindsay had said, please talk to this guy who worked for John Hyland and say, so I've stopped giving advice to the de Blasio kids.
Okay.
Errol, you had a great ending here, but we never mentioned the Vietnam War and the veterans coming back and the drug problem that we faced in the city and what happened. I mean, those were incredible things that have never been duplicated. Right, never mentioned.
Okay, you want to, tomorrow night, meet you here at the same place.
Yes, the red light is on, so
All right.
we're gonna make that the last word. Thank you all so much.
Come on.